Well, the government is under attack these days for all manner of policies and scandals. It's that time of year, after all. Questions about competence, trust, and leadership all being bandied about. There is no election in sight with the Liberal NDP deal in place to operate as a majority government. Still, there is ongoing focus on the Conservatives as an alternative. There is a leadership, as everybody knows, underway, and two key outcomes on the provincial front: a huge victory for Doug Ford in Ontario, and Alberta's Premier Jason Kenney kicked to the curb by his own party. Our guest today recently wrote an article entitled "A Lament for Conservatism." Sean Speer is a political analyst and a Monk Senior Fellow for Fiscal Policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He has about 16 other jobs. He is also the editor-at-large at The Hub, a news and commentary website focused on Canadian policy and governance. So, Mr. Speer, what do you make of it all? What does Doug Ford's really quite overwhelming victory suggest to you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on, Senator Wallin. This is such a great platform to get out of the the toing and froing of day-to-day politics and think big picture. And there's a need for big picture thinking in the world of conservatism these days for the very reasons that you describe. The National Party isn't just selecting a leader. It seems to me it's also making some judgments about who it is and what it stands for. And, that's reflected across some of the different candidates vying for the leadership. And then, as you say, we have these two pretty major developments in provincial conservative politics in the form of the re-election of Doug Ford on one hand and the sacking of Jason Kenney on the other hand. Maybe just to address your question directly about the Ford government's re-election. It seems to me the one thing that the Ford government has done well, and which ought to serve as something of a set of insights or lessons for the National Party, is it's found a way to make inroads in the ridings in and around the city of Toronto that the National Party has struggled with ever since the 2011 election campaign. And my kind of take is that it's done that primarily by being kind of temperamentally moderate. That is to say, I don't think the government is necessarily a moderate government. It has advanced some conservative priorities, but it's found a way to be empathetic and connect its agenda to the kind of interests and needs and concerns of median voters in the suburbs of the province. And the National Party, in a way, has done the opposite. At different times, it's sort of had a moderate policy agenda, but rhetorically and temperamentally, it's been a bit more extreme. And I've kind of joked sometimes that Stephen Harper's political genius was that he was a conservative by virtually any measure, but he wasn't threatening or intimidating in his temperament or the way he communicated or talked about his politics. And I think that basic model is still right for Canadian conservatism. And in a way, I think the Doug Ford re-election affirms that working hypothesis.
He went from sort of a buck a beer the first time around to really, and I think others have captured this, to focusing on quality of life issues, whether that's safety on the streets or health care, and people can debate whether it was successful, but that's what he talks about. He talks about the issues that matter more like local politicians do than national politicians, right? So he's found that middle ground. So is there a lesson there then? I mean, do you think when you look at the field of candidates for the national leadership, it's not clear that that's the direction the party's headed?
Yeah, I think the Poilievre campaign is making an interesting bet, and that bet is that the energy and momentum around that campaign won't just galvanize core conservative voters, which it self-evidently is, and we've seen that with the size of his crowds and the purported number of memberships that he sold, but that it will actually bring people from outside of mainstream politics into politics, and in effect, kind of enlarge the voter universe. I saw a pollster talking today in a Canadian press story. I won't mention his name or the name of the company, but he said, it's the only way conservatives can win is if they take votes from the liberals and New Democrats. And in a way, Poilievre is proposing an alternative, which is to bring people in who haven't participated in the political system. That's something that the Trudeau Liberals did in 2015. Was
brought the youth in.
Yeah, instead of thinking of the Canadian voter universe in zero-sum terms, they thought of it in positive-sum terms. And so I guess that's a long way of saying that's the approach that the Poilievre campaign is pursuing. But I would say it's a bet. The reason it's a bit of a risk is that these are voters who almost by definition aren't reliable, and you need to continue to find a way to speak to them. I'll stop rambling in a second. But I think it's a combination of issues, and some of the issues that Mr. Poilievre was talking about. But part of it is tactical. You spent a long time in the media. One of the interesting things is Poilievre is using podcasts like Jordan Peterson's to reach these voters who are who, as I say, are by and large out of the world of mainstream politics. And that's slightly different than what the Ford government did for re-election, but it does represent a kind of another path for Canadian conservatism.
What you see in the Ottawa mindset and where the coverage is focused is that, so he has this oppositional mindset. He tackles the government on this policy and that policy and what they're putting forward, as you would standing in the House of Commons as the leader of the opposition. And he does a good job at that. Can you translate that into pick me as Prime Minister?
Yeah, I think that's the fundamental question. A few weeks ago, Senator Wallin, Ross Douthat, the New York Times in-house conservative columnist, wrote something. I'm paraphrasing. I don't have the passage in front of me, but he said something like the kind of Ron DeSantis political proposition is that you are sufficiently oppositional so as to trigger liberal outrage and satisfy populist voters that you're one of them and that you're reliable, without going too far so as to alienate swing voters who ultimately conservatives need to win in places like the GTA. So it is a very kind of delicate and precise balance that someone like Mr. Poilievre needs to walk. But I will just say that for all of the risks associated with that type of political strategy, I think it is sort of more how would I put it? It is a greater recognition, I think, of the kind of political moment we find ourselves in and the energy that exists on the political right than someone like Mr. Charest's campaign, which for all of the potential upside with swing voters, I think is probably failing to kind of reckon with the state of base conservative politics these days. And you see that in polls where Mr. Poilievre is the preferred candidate by something like 44, 45% amongst conservatives, and Mr. Charest is, below 15%.
But that's what I mean, sometimes we forget our own history, no matter how recent it is. But when the Progressive Conservative Party united with the Reform Party, or merged, might be a better word, rather than united, it became a different party. And so to hearken back, although Doug Ford still calls himself a progressive conservative, so there is a change, and it's pretty fundamental.
I think that's such an important point, Senator Wallin. And just to emphasize it, do you know that there are only 2 current sitting members of Parliament who ran under the banner of the former legacy parties? And in fact, something like half of the current Conservative caucus in the House of Commons was elected in 2019 and 2021 alone. So the idea that there are these people who still are connected to the political identity of the old legacy parties just strikes me as increasingly less salient. That now, there are people, for instance, who are voting age, who know nothing but the Conservative Party of Canada because it's now older than 18 years old. So I guess that's a long way of saying I think that's exactly right. That the metamorphosis of these two legacy parties into one has kind of changed the character of both. And I think Pierre Poilievre kind of understands that in a very instinctive way. And it's something that the Schray campaign has struggled a bit more with to kind of find its footing and find its message with a group of voters that isn't quite the same that it used to be.
So explain, if you can, what happened with Jason Kenney. I mean, this is a very, very bright man. He went home after serving in Ottawa to lead his province. But I was just at an event last week and talking to a group of Albertans, and their concern was there was no touch. That once you've been in Ottawa, and no matter how good you were at your job there, it's a different relationship that you have with the voter, and your sensibility and your ability to feel to seem authentic to them is somehow marred by even your time in Ottawa.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. There's clearly something of a kind of political moment happening in the province of Alberta, which is in part a reflection, frankly, of the Trudeau government's mishandling of regional relationships. And I think there's an argument that the pandemic was the kind of perfect emergency to poke at some of these fissures that exist within Alberta conservatism, and that's a set of challenges that Doug Ford didn't quite face, where there was much greater kind of party unity in his response to the pandemic relative to Alberta. You mentioned at the outset that my immediate reaction to Jason Kenney's sacking was an article that I wrote called "The Lament for Conservatism." I wrote it the night of the result. And the reason I called it lament, Senator Wallin, is that I think that the Kenney government, for notwithstanding some of the issues that you rightly described, was advancing a really exciting and ambitious center-right policy agenda that touched on virtually every area of provincial policy, from education to healthcare to taxes, regulation, drug addiction and rehabilitation, where there's really some exciting developments there. So it bugs me a bit that some conservatives, because this was an intra-party issue, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems to me chose to kind of express their general frustration with some of these tangential issues without recognizing that there was some really exciting things happening in the province. And that's why I ultimately called my essay a lament.
We see these shifts, but Kenney isn't really a shift, because that happens in elections. I mean, we have watched, George Bush beget Obama, who begetted Trump, who brought it back to Biden. In this country, we've seen the same, from Trudeau Sr. to Mulroney, or Stephen Harper to Trudeau Jr. in that sense. So that we see those shifts on the larger scale. But as you say, this was internal. So are we reading too much into it to say Alberta's changing, or is this just an internal fight for power, and it doesn't say much about the national stage or the larger picture?
No, I think it does. Okay. There is, it seems to me there is a kind of energy within the world of conservatism. You must encounter it. You're traveling the country so much, and it's a multifaceted explanation for why this energy exists. I do think the pandemic is obviously a big part of it. The fact that the People's Party's level of support went from something like 1.5% in 2019 to north of 5 points in 2021, I think speaks to that energy, for lack of a better term, one might describe as populist. I would say, though, Senator Wallin, that I think a big part of the explanation is that it's something of a dialogue with what's occurring on the Canadian left. This is a piece of the puzzle I think that a lot of people in the media either don't see or don't want to talk about. That there's a tendency to say, oh, there's this extremism or ideological excess or whatever you describe it occurring on the right, and I actually think there's something to that. But I think it is working in parallel with kind of the inverted developments on the left. You mentioned some of the previous liberal governments that we've seen in past decades. I mean, it's fair to say that the Trudeau government, not just on economic and fiscal matters, but on a broader set of cultural and identity issues, is self-evidently to the left of the Chrétien government and even the previous Trudeau government. You mentioned Joe Biden. It's amazing to think of it, right? Like, when Barack Obama ran against Hillary Clinton in 2007, 2008, he was a left-wing insurgent.
Exactly.
Today, he would be sitting on the kind of right edge of the Democratic Party. So I think there's a lot of kind of ferment occurring on both poles of our political spectrum. And it's actually, I think, has to be understood as something of a dialogue occurring between the two sides. I observe these trends most clearly in the world of conservatism because that's your world. That's my world. But I think it would be a mistake to only see one half of the equation.
It's a really interesting point because, and I want to get into that kind of the identity politics of the left versus the grievance politics on the right. But there's something more. The populism of the right, which has become such a dirty word, talking about people and freedom and all of those things. But as you say, like the authoritarian tendencies of the left, we're seeing it in the US and we're seeing it here, which is clamping down on free speech. You either agree with us or you don't. You're out of the discussion. Like, those tendencies are just as troubling, maybe more so.
I'm afraid I agree. I think that's right. And it, if anything, Senator Wallin, the one positive takeaway of this discussion is I do think that the public is reacting to those developments, and they should, in theory, produce something of a political correction. Let's just be concrete about it. We're seeing in major Canadian newspapers voices in and around the Ontario Liberal Party and the Ontario New Democratic parties saying we lost the last election because we kind of traded off bread and butter economic issues concerning working class people. And instead, we're focused on this narrow set of niche identity politic issues that caused the Progressive Conservative Party under Doug Ford to pick up seats in Thunder Bay, Timmins, Windsor, parts of the province where conservatives have been uncompetitive for decades. So one can't help but think that some of this radicalism that we're seeing on the left may be the subject of some kind of political correction. And if it does, if you accept the premise that developments on the right are at least in part a reaction to what we're seeing on the left, I hope that it starts to lead to something of an overall moderation across politics, not just in Canada, but really across the Western world. Let me just give one more example. I think one of the most compelling examples in recent years is Glenn Youngkin's gubernatorial election in the state of Virginia, where that's a purple state, in fact, probably increasingly moving in a blue direction, and yet Youngkin ran and won as a Republican on these issues around left-wing ideological excesses in the education system. And I think that has been interpreted in some parts of democratic politics in the U.S. as a lesson. And so I guess that's a long way of saying I think you're exactly right that some of the trends we're seeing on the left are as bad or even in some cases worse than what we're seeing on the right. But I think there are signs that the public gets that, and the left is being punished for it across different Anglosphere countries.
That virtue signaling is not enough, or that the woke mindset, which has really restricted debate and discussion. I mean, we were having a meeting yesterday and talking about that, about what you dare not say or raise in conversation anymore that used to be fair game, certainly in the political world.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't want to get too controversial because I know that you have a broad audience, but we're seeing right now in the U.S. as Supreme Court justices deliberate on this abortion case, which is divisive and morally complex. I don't want to diminish it. But we have protesters following the judges' children to school, following their families to their places of worship. We've had, what sounds like a credible assassination threat. And, for all of the talk about the right harming institutions, which we hear about ad nauseum, I mean, this kind of protest and activities represent a serious threat to the institution of the U.S. Supreme Court. And yet, for some reason, there's a cognitive dissonance when it comes to a lot of mainstream commentary. So I guess that's a long way of saying, there's something of a pox on both houses. But one hopes that soon the kind of silent majority who are, I think pretty reasonable, see kind of see insights on both sides of the political spectrum, will start to wrestle control of our politics away from, the radical left and, as you say, the kind of grievance politics on the right.
I was reading the Edelman Trust Barometer the other day. This is a US-based organization, but they do work everywhere, and they did work here in Canada. This is the 2022 report. And the one page that struck me, so increasing concerns on the part of the public that they are being misled by their societal leaders. 61% fear being misled by journalists, 60% by business leaders, 58% by government leaders. That is a pretty significant breakdown in trust and historical relationships.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. And the patrons of these institutions, it's a kind of Burkean conservative insight that we pass our ideas and our institutions, and we inherit them from one generation, and we pass them on to the next. And the current people who occupy these institutions, need to see themselves as part of that historical, reach. And when journalists see themselves as part of a narrative as opposed to reporting on the facts, they risk doing permanent harm to those institutions. When when the Bank of Canada governor tells us for months that inflation is transitory and there's nothing to see here, and anyone who dare questions him and the bank are being partisan or something like that, and now we're seeing higher and higher interest rates to try to wrestle the inflation that was that we were told wasn't a problem, that risks doing harm to an institution. I do think, Senator Wallin, there's an onus on all of us who are, for lack of a better term, elites, to take seriously our responsibility and duty to protect public trust in our institutions.
Yeah, it's I fear for what the consequences are, as you say, and you cited the American example, when people go and follow a judge's kids home and there's no repercussions, we're starting to break down the basic. It
didn't even get reported, right?
No,
I mean, if you the assassination, the planned assassination of Senator Justice Brett Kavanaugh was on page 820 of the New York Times. that is the kind of that is the kind of thing that reaffirms people's distrust of these major institutions, and as stewards of these institutions, we just have to take our duties and responsibilities seriously. And I guess I would just say, in the name of being a kind of equal opportunity critic, that goes for both sides. So
Yep.
I think the Trudeau government, its kind of tendency to politicize some of these issues is harmful. But I do think that conservatives, including in the current party leadership, need to resist the temptation to galvanize, what is an already pretty hotly tempered party
Yep.
base, because the short-term gains, it seems to me, aren't worth the kind of long-term risks to political stability and social cohesion.
As you see play out with the debate on the Emergencies Act or all of those related issues. In the piece, back to what you were writing, you recalled a conference that went on called The Winds of Change. This was back in 1996, where people were getting together in the West, in Calgary, to talk about the emergence of a new right and the uniting the right. And it was the beginnings of reform and the progressive conservatives coming together. And the election the next year, the Liberals won. Despite all this talk. Now, I know things don't happen instantly, but is it still the case, do you believe, in this country, that Liberals just have a bigger share of the political marketplace, and that it's going to be very hard to ever form or find that coalition or the group or the message that will move them out of that position, that it just seems to be a reaction on the part of the voter that we've had enough of these guys, so we're going to throw them out and then we're going to try you. But that doesn't last very long. Then after a few years, it's back to what used to be called the natural governing party. Where do you think we are on that whole scale of movement?
Wow, Senator Wallin, that's a big picture question.
Yes, it is, and you have a big picture brain.
So here's how I think I would answer it. Listeners will have heard that I'm a conservative.
Yes.
That's my kind of worldview. Those are the ideas and values that I broadly subscribe to. I came to those ideas and values, Senator Wallin, because I think, on balance, they're both good and right. That is to say, they best describe reality than any other set of ideas or values on offer. And maybe it's naivety on my part, but I happen to think a conservatism that communicates those ideas and values in an aspirational, positive way, in the service of the interests and needs of ordinary people, going back to our conversation about Premier Ford's reelection, can be a 50% plus one proposition in Canada. You mentioned the Winds of Change conference. It was, what's fascinating in hindsight about that conference, which celebrated its 26th anniversary just in the past few weeks, is that there were very few political people there in hindsight. It was a combination of academics and journalists and think tankers and so on. And it was really fundamentally about ideas. And what was amazing going back and looking at the conference, Senator Wallin, is a lot of the ideas they were talking about only a decade or so later became the foundation of the Harper government's policy agenda. Many of the things that were talked about at that conference ultimately found expression during the Harper years. So I guess that's a long way of saying, and this is why I like your podcast so much, we can talk about political strategy and tactics and all the rest, and that's deeply important. but I think a kind of confident, assertive conservatism that isn't insecure about its place in the world, that isn't focused on quote unquote owning the libs, but is instead putting forward an aspirational, positive view about the country, can be more than simply the government that comes in to clean up the mess of the liberals every quarter century or something like that, and can actually compete for power on a consistent basis across the country. That's what, in a way, that's what my professional work is kind of dedicated to, in a way, is trying to provide that intellectual and policy scaffolding for a center-right politics. So I hope I'm right, but I think I am.
The question, though, always remains of, and it's now described these days as voter efficiency, which it's just easier for liberals to win because they tend to have the big cities, the urban ridings, and conservative vote is still spread out over rural areas and smaller places. And so it's not very efficient, and it doesn't always elect people.
Yeah, we have, it's a bit counterintuitive, isn't it, that we have, that there was all this talk after the 2016 presidential election about Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote, but losing the electoral college. In Canada, we've had now 2 elections where conservatives have won the popular vote, but failed to win the overall election because, as you say, this voter efficiency issue. I just think that, in 2011, the Conservative Party was competitive in the parts of the country where it needs to be in order to form government. And the Ford government has just done it now in back-to-back elections in the province of Ontario. And so I remain optimistic that Conservatives can be competitive in the suburbs in and around Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. And more importantly, Senator Wallin, I think that they can be competitive in those places without making major compromises to their ideas and values, because that's one idea on offer, right? To basically, you hear a lot of this in the mainstream media. Conservatives just need to basically match the liberals on as many policy areas as they can, create as little daylight between the two parties as possible, and that's the path to victory. But it seems to me that there's the other path is the kind of aspirational, positive conservatism that I mentioned earlier, and that, I think, starts with a clear understanding of the party's ideas and commitments, and then the kind of moderate temperament that I was talking about earlier. In hindsight, Stephen Harper was even more of a kind of special politician than we probably understood at the time, because he matched this, as I said earlier, genuine conservatism. You could put his conservatism up against kind of anyone who's come up in politics in, the past quarter century or longer. But he was someone who connected with ordinary voters, in the GTA and so on. I think I mentioned in that lament for conservatism this wonderful quote of his from the 2006 election campaign. I won't remember it verbatim, but he said something like, if you make conservatism responsive to the interests and needs of ordinary people, you make it the most powerful political philosophy in the Western world. And I think that sentence basically reflects how I continue to think about conservative politics in Canada, and how conservatives can get over this hump, whereby it's winning the national popular vote, but failing to make the gains in the places it needs to in order to ultimately form government.
But always with that economic undertone. I mean, it seems to be, when we talk about all these social issues, it's interesting, and it affects people's lives. And as you say, the U.S. examples where what's going on in the schools actually brought someone to power. But fundamentally, Canadians are pretty economically conservative. I mean, I grew up in a province where people voted for the CCF and the NDP provincially and the Conservatives federally at that time, because both of them were minding the books. and that somehow that's a strain. So, I mean, I'm just wondering, when you hear Bill Morneau say that his former colleagues are too focused on redistributing income rather than generating it, whether you two are becoming political soulmates here in terms of what you think's important.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. It comes back to my point earlier, which is that there's the political polarization that we're seeing between this dialogue of the left and right is leaving this space available to an enterprising politician and party who, as you say, Senator Wallin, communicates a kind of practical, common sense policy agenda focused on bread and butter issues. And that's kind of what Ford did, right?
That's what I think the message is. Yeah.
The Ontario NDP and the Liberals were focused on all of this tangential stuff that is kind of attractive to hardcore progressive ideologues, but is, just drops like a rock in places like Thunder Bay or Timmins or Windsor, where the Conservative Party was able to make gains. So I think there's a lesson there for conservatives. And, we're having this conversation against a backdrop of increasing economic turmoil. One can't help but think that that creates an opening for that kind of practical, common sense economic agenda for conservatives to advance in what I guess will be the next election in 2025.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear your views, because you are that next gen, but you're also a lifelong conservative drawn to these very basic principles that you've been talking about. It's great to have the conversation. Thank you.
Well, it's my pleasure, Senator Wallin. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about these issues. They're so important. And maybe just make one final point, if I may. You mentioned the next generation. I think this is the most underreported yet most exciting development occurring within Canadian conservatism. Half of the current shadow cabinet are millennials or younger. Yeah. Just think about this. There is one millennial in the Trudeau cabinet, but if you look across the front bench, about half of the critics are millennials. I think that for all of the talk about conservatives being old white men, there's something kind of interesting happening, and I think this generational change is going to have important effects on how conservatives think and talk about policies, even the policy issues they're thinking and talking about. But I think it's something that the mainstream media has neglected to cover, and yet will have big consequences for conservatism moving forward.
Could not agree more on that point. So Sean Speer, I'm just going to list some of his jobs: political analyst, Monk Senior Fellow for Fiscal Policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, works with the Public Policy Forum, former advisor to Stephen Harper, editor-at-large at The Hub, a news and commentary website. That covers some of it. And Dad, because you missed all this, but right at the beginning of our conversation, before we started, when we turned on the screen, there was Sean sitting with his baby boy on his lap. It was very adorable. You're training him early. This is the next gen.
Thanks so much, Senator Wallin.
Thanks a lot. We'll talk soon again. And that is it for No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin for today. We'll talk and see you again soon. Bye-bye.